Dr. Ethan Clarke adjusted his environmental suit, the thick jungle of Zerthon 5 sprawling before him. The air shimmered with humidity, and faint alien calls echoed in the distance. Ethan wasn't new to the planet's dangers. It was home to the Aegis Dragons, apex predators whose deadly reputation had turned them into myths even among seasoned xenobiologists. Yet, something about this place always drew him back, its untamed beauty, the mysteries lurking in its dense foliage. As he pressed forward, his scanner beeped erratically. The display showed an anomaly nearby, a cluster of unusual heat signatures. Ethan's curiosity piqued. The device guided him toward a clearing, and as he stepped through the tangled underbrush, his breath caught. The ground was scorched black, the remnants of a battle stark against the vibrant jungle. In the center of the chaos lay a massive creature, unmistakably an Aegis Dragon. Its body, nearly 20 meters long, bore deep gashes, and its shimmering obsidian scales were dulled by death. Ethan cautiously approached, his heart pounding. Dead Aegis dragons were almost unheard of, they were creatures of legend, their resilience unmatched. Yet here was one, lifeless and surrounded by signs of violence, claw marks, scorched earth, and the remnants of what appeared to be high-powered weaponry. As he surveyed the scene, a soft, almost imperceptible sound reached his ears. Ethan froze, straining to identify it. It wasn't the guttural growl of an adult dragon or the hum of an approaching predator. It was weaker, softer, a cry. Following the sound, he found a clutch of eggshell fragments, their edges jagged and broken. Among them, huddled together, were 3 small hatchlings. They were no larger than house cats, their scales a mesmerizing blend of black and gold, glinting faintly in the filtered sunlight. Ethan knelt slowly, his movements deliberate. The hatchlings stared back, their wide, luminous eyes filled with both fear and curiosity. One emitted a weak chirp, its tiny claws scrabbling against the ground. Ethan's heart twisted. They were alone, their protector gone. He could only imagine the terror they must have felt during the attack. He hesitated, torn between protocol and instinct. The Intergalactic Research Coalition strictly forbade interference with Zerthon 5's wildlife, let alone its apex predators. But Ethan wasn't just a scientist. He was a man who had known loss. The memory of his wife and daughter, their absence a constant ache, pushed him forward. He couldn't leave them here, vulnerable to scavengers or worse. "I can't just walk away," he murmured, his voice barely audible. Carefully, he extended his hands. The hatchlings flinched but didn't flee, their exhaustion evident. One, slightly bolder than the others, sniffed his glove before nuzzling into his palm. Ethan felt a surge of determination. Gathering the fragile creatures into a makeshift carrier, he turned back toward his facility. As he carried them through the jungle, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment would change everything. Ethan adjusted the temperature controls of the habitat he had hastily assembled in his facility, ensuring the environment was warm and humid, mimicking the dragon's natural conditions. The hatchlings, Astra, Pyros, and Nyx, as he had named them, were fragile but surprisingly adaptive. Ethan worked tirelessly, feeding them a concoction of proteins and minerals he synthesized based on data from previous studies of Aegis dragons. The hatchlings quickly showed signs of growth. Astra was the most curious, often wandering to the edge of their enclosure, observing Ethan as he worked. Pyros was bold and fiery, literally. The small creature had nearly burned one of Ethan's research terminals when it sneezed, expelling a sudden, unexpected burst of flame. Nyx, the smallest and quietest, had a knack for disappearing entirely, blending seamlessly into her surroundings despite her shimmering scales. Ethan marveled at their intelligence. They weren't just instinctual predators. Within days, they began to recognize him, responding to his voice and movements. Astra, in particular, seemed to study him, tilting her head as though trying to understand his words. Their bond grew as Ethan spent hours caring for them, talking to them despite knowing they couldn't fully understand. Yet, there were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when they met his gaze, and he felt they understood far more than they let on. Hiding them wasn't easy. The IRC had strict surveillance protocols, and any anomaly could attract attention. Ethan worked late into the night, modifying his facility systems to mask their presence. He repurposed energy signatures and rerouted monitoring devices, ensuring the dragons remained undetected. It was risky, but the alternative, exposure and inevitable exploitation, was unthinkable. The hatchlings' growth was astonishing. Within weeks, they had doubled in size, their abilities becoming more pronounced. Pyros began to practice his fire-breathing, often leaving scorch marks on the reinforced walls of the enclosure. Ethan scrambled to reinforce the habitat, though part of him was impressed by the precision with which Pyros controlled the flames. Nyx, meanwhile, had developed a remarkable ability to blend into her environment entirely. One moment she was there, and the next she seemed to vanish, her scales refracting light in a way that rendered her nearly invisible. Astra, however, stood out the most. She displayed a level of awareness that bordered on unsettling. She often sat by the reinforced glass, watching Ethan as he typed notes or worked on new experiments. One evening, as he explained a piece of equipment aloud, a habit he developed since their arrival, Astra tapped the glass with her claw, mimicking the motion he had made moments before. Ethan froze, his breath catching. She was learning. Their bond deepened as the weeks turned into months. The hatchlings began to treat him as one of their own, nuzzling him affectionately and chirping softly when he entered the room. He found solace in their company, a connection that filled the void he had carried for years. Yet, despite their rapid development, Ethan couldn't ignore the signs of unease. Astra often stared at the horizon through the enclosure's transparent ceiling, her body tense, as if sensing a threat Ethan couldn't perceive. He pushed the thought aside, focusing on their care and growth. But a lingering worry settled in his chest. They were extraordinary, too extraordinary to remain hidden forever. The crash of distant explosions echoed across the jungle as Ethan stumbled through the underbrush, his body bruised and his mind racing. He had managed to survive the escape pod landing, but the sight of the burning ship in the distance haunted him. The hatchlings had saved him, but their fate was uncertain. He couldn't allow himself to believe they were gone, not after everything they had been through. Ethan's portable scanner beeped faintly, picking up weak energy signatures moving toward the eastern ridge. His heart leapt. The patterns were too distinct to be anything but the hatchlings. He moved as quickly as he could, ignoring the pain in his limbs and the oppressive heat of the jungle. Each step brought him closer to the signal and the hope that they were alive. As he neared the ridge, the undergrowth rustled, and he froze. Out of the shadows stepped Astra, her scales dulled with soot but her eyes blazing with intensity. Behind her, Pyros and Nyx emerged, battered but alive. Relief flooded Ethan, and he dropped to his knees, overwhelmed by the sight of them. Astra approached first, nudging his shoulder gently, while Pyros let out a low, defiant growl at the smoke-filled sky. Nyx, true to her nature, remained in the shadows, her gaze scanning their surroundings. Their reunion was brief. Astra growled low, her posture tense, and Ethan followed her gaze. The mercenaries weren't finished. Survivors from the crash were regrouping, their shouts carrying through the jungle. They wouldn't stop until they had what they came for. Ethan realized the hatchlings understood this too. They weren't running anymore. They were preparing to fight. Ethan wanted to stop them, to insist they flee, but he knew better. These creatures weren't helpless. They were apex predators, and now they had a purpose. He grabbed a makeshift weapon from his pack, a modified plasma cutter, and stood alongside them. "We do this together," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The first wave of mercenaries came with heavy firepower, but they underestimated their opponents. Pyros unleashed a torrent of flames, creating barriers of fire that forced the attackers into vulnerable positions. Nyx moved like a shadow, appearing and disappearing as she took out stragglers with surgical precision. Astra was a force of nature, using her strength and speed to disarm and incapacitate the mercenaries with devastating efficiency. Ethan did his part, using his knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver the attackers and disable their equipment. The hatchlings worked in perfect harmony, their bond evident in the way they anticipated each other's moves. For every trap laid by the mercenaries, the dragons countered with raw power and strategy. As the last of the mercenaries retreated, beaten and terrified, Ethan felt a strange mix of exhaustion and pride. The clearing was littered with the remnants of weapons and equipment, but the hatchlings stood triumphant, their gazes fixed on him. For the first time, he truly saw them as what they were, creatures of unparalleled strength and intelligence, capable of shaping their own destiny. Astra approached him, her eyes meeting his. In that moment, no words were needed. Ethan understood what she was telling him. They weren't just his responsibility anymore. They were his allies, his family. The sky above Zerthan 5 darkened as the rumble of approaching ships echoed through the jungle. Ethan stood with the hatchlings at the edge of a cliff, staring at the fleet descending from orbit. This wasn't a simple recovery operation by the mercenaries. It was a full-scale assault. The ships bore the insignia of a powerful corporate entity known for exploiting rare species, and their arrival confirmed Ethan's worst fears. They weren't just after the hatchlings, they wanted control of the entire ecosystem, and they wouldn't leave until everything of value was stripped from the planet. The hatchlings were restless, sensing the gravity of the situation. Astra, as always, took the lead, her gaze fixed on the incoming threat. Pyros stomped the ground, his flames sparking in agitation, while Nyx slipped into the shadows, already preparing for what was to come. Ethan clenched his fists, knowing there was no running this time. The fleet's overwhelming firepower meant escape was impossible. If they wanted to survive, they would have to fight. Ethan began gathering what little resources they had. He modified his remaining equipment, creating crude but effective traps from the wreckage of the mercenaries' weapons. The hatchlings watched him work, their instincts sharp, their movements precise. They had grown into powerful creatures, but Ethan could see the hesitation in their eyes. This wasn't a simple hunt. It was a battle for their lives, and the odds were stacked against them. The first wave of drones descended, their sleek forms cutting through the jungle canopy. Ethan activated one of his traps, sending a shockwave through the air that disabled several drones at once. Pyros let out a triumphant roar, unleashing a blast of fire that consumed another cluster. Nyx darted through the chaos, dismantling the remaining drones with precision strikes. Astra, larger and more imposing than ever, stood guard over Ethan, her presence a constant reassurance. But the drones were just the beginning. Troop carriers landed in the clearing below, unloading squads of heavily armed soldiers. Their advanced weaponry glinted in the dim light, and their movements were methodical. Ethan's heart raced as he realized the scale of the attack. The soldiers were coordinated, their weapons designed to neutralize even the deadliest predators. The hatchlings didn't hesitate. Pyros charged first, a blazing whirlwind of fire and fury that scattered the front lines. Nyx struck from the shadows, her camouflage rendering her invisible until it was too late. Astra led the charge, her roars shaking the ground as she plowed through their ranks with raw power. Ethan provided cover, using his knowledge of the terrain to outwit the soldiers and disable their equipment. Despite their strength, the fight was grueling. The soldiers' numbers seemed endless, and the hatchlings were beginning to tire. Ethan's mind raced as he searched for a way to turn the tide. Then he saw it, a command ship hovering above the battlefield, its shield generator exposed. If they could disable it, the fleet would lose its coordination, and the remaining forces would retreat. Ethan pointed it out to Astra, who immediately understood. She called to Pyros and Nyx, and together they launched a coordinated assault. Pyros melted through the first layer of defenses, while Nyx disabled the shield generator with a precise strike. Astra delivered the final blow, a thunderous roar that shattered the ship's main systems. The command ship faltered, its lights flickering before it crashed into the jungle below. The remaining forces, now leaderless, began to retreat. Ethan watched as the fleet ascended back into orbit, leaving behind a battlefield scarred but quiet. The hatchlings stood victorious, their scales shimmering in the fading light. Astra approached Ethan, her eyes meeting his with a mixture of pride and gratitude. Ethan placed a hand on her head, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. "You did it. We did it." The bond between them was unspoken but undeniable. They had faced impossible odds and emerged stronger, not just as allies but as family. As the jungle settled into silence, Ethan knew the hatchlings couldn't stay. Their presence would always attract danger, and the only way to protect them was to let them go. With a heavy heart, he led them to a hidden transport he had salvaged from the mercenaries. He programmed the coordinates to an uncharted region of space, far from the reach of corporations and poachers. Astra hesitated as the hatchlings prepared to leave, turning back to nuzzle against Ethan one last time. He swallowed hard, fighting back tears as he placed a hand on her snout. "You'll be safe out there. Just remember me." The transport doors closed, and Ethan watched as it disappeared into the sky. He stood alone, the jungle quiet once more. Despite the emptiness he felt, there was a deep sense of fulfillment. He had given them a chance to survive, to thrive, and they had given him a purpose he hadn't known he needed. As the stars twinkled above, Ethan smiled faintly. Somewhere out there, Astra, Pyros, and Nyx were carving their place in the universe. And he knew, without a doubt, they would never forget him.